For 10,000 years, the Imperium of Man has been sealing mortally wounded space marines inside walking coffins and calling it the highest honor a warrior can receive. The machine is designated a Dreadnought. The armored core housing the occupant is officially classified as a sarcophagus, not poetically, not as metaphor, but as technical nomenclature chosen by designers who understood exactly what they were building. Commander Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels, has served for over 1,500 years. He's the oldest living loyalist space marine outside a Dreadnought chassis, and he has wanted to die for centuries. When his body finally breaks, his chapter will almost certainly seal him inside one. His fate is where this ends. Dreadnought entombment is forced imprisonment disguised as glory. The Marines locked inside often beg not to be. And the Imperium's newest chassis, the Redemptor, has made everything worse by destroying the one consolation the old coffins ever offered. The cruelty begins with the Castroferum chassis itself. Canon sources across the lore call it a living tomb, with the consistency of an admission the Imperium can't quite suppress. A coffin with legs and guns, draped in liturgical language and called sacred. Entombment starts with catastrophe, never ceremony. A space marine suffers wounds so devastating that even his transhuman physiology, decades of organ implantation, genetic rewriting, a body engineered to survive punishment that would atomize a baseline human, can't save him. Torsos ripped from limbs, spinal columns severed, organs reduced to pulp by weapons a galaxy has spent 41 millennia perfecting. The warrior is dying. In many cases, he's conscious enough to know it. An apothecary arrives and faces a binary decision that will define whatever remains of this warrior's existence, an existence that may now stretch for millennia more. Two options sit on the table. The apothecary can offer the Emperor's mercy, a bolt pistol round or a lethal chemical injection, the Imperium's clinical euphemism for euthanasia. Or the apothecary can flag the warrior for entombment. Euthanasia gets called mercy. Entombment gets called honor. That asymmetry tells you everything about the Imperium's moral architecture before a single bolt is fired from a Dreadnought's arm. What follows is surgical and irreversible. Whatever remains of the Space Marine, the lore describes it as a tightly curled and shriveled organic component, is suspended in amniotic fluid inside the sarcophagus core. The image is deliberately fetal. A warrior who once stood over 7 feet tall, compressed into something embryonic, floating in chemical suspension, wired into the machine through mind impulse units that translate his thoughts into movement. The machine keeps his mind because his mind contains centuries of battlefield experience. His inability to refuse is a feature, not a defect of the system. Wind on skin vanishes. Taste of food vanishes. A brother's handshake, gone, permanently, irrevocably. Everything from the outside world reaches the pilot through cyborganic neural links and sensor arrays feeding data into whatever remains of his nervous system. Every experience arrives mediated, translated, flattened into something that resembles perception the way a photograph of fire resembles warmth. Telemetry represents a battlefield the pilot can't walk through with feet he no longer has. Audio signals routed through communication arrays stand in for voices that once carried warmth and recognition. The body is gone. The senses are gone. Consciousness remains, sealed in amniotic fluid and ceramite, and consciousness inside a Dreadnought is the cruelest gift the Imperium has ever learned to bestow. Between battles, a Dreadnought enters stasis, dreamless hibernation designed to preserve both the machine's mechanisms and the pilot's sanity. But designed to carries enormous weight in any sentence about the Imperium. Remaining conscious without stasis leads to extreme isolation, psychological deterioration, and outright madness. Sealed in darkness and chemical fluid, stripped of every human sense, with nothing to perceive and nothing to do, the pilot begins to lose coherence. Catatonia takes some, violence seizes others. The worst cases dissolve entirely, identities eroding into the machine until there is no pilot, Only the Dreadnought, raging and directionless, a weapon that has consumed the hand wielding it. When dissolution takes hold, the Imperium doesn't reconsider. The Imperium reaches for chains. Literal chains. Accounts across the lore describe dreadnoughts physically restrained during lucid episodes because the pilot inside has descended into incoherent fury. The blind thrashing of a mind locked in solitary confinement for centuries that has finally, irreversibly shattered. These breakdowns aren't malfunctions. They're the predictable outcome of sealing a conscious being in sensory deprivation for longer than most civilizations endure. Every chapter knows this. Every tech marine monitoring a sarcophagus understands the trajectory. And across 10,000 years of accumulated evidence, not one chapter has reconsidered the practice. Chaplains frame it as sacred. Codex entries describe entombment as the highest distinction a space marine can receive. Continuation of service beyond the threshold of death. The privilege of fighting on when lesser warriors would have been granted oblivion's peace. You have been chosen. You are too valuable to lose. Your wisdom, your centuries of battle knowledge, these belong to the chapter, not to you, and certainly not to the grave. Official language speaks of spirits enduring in service to the emperor, of bonds between warrior and institution that transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. Strip that language away, and the reality underneath is a dying man, often conscious, often begging for the release that the emperor's mercy would grant, hardwired into a machine he didn't ask for, sealed inside a box he can't leave, kept alive in conditions that would destroy a baseline human sanity in weeks. He will endure it for centuries, for millennia. The honor is a life sentence with no possibility of parole, administered by an institution that decided before this particular warrior was born that his potential future suffering weighs less than his potential future usefulness. Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves knows this sentence as intimately as any being in the galaxy. He walked alongside the Emperor himself and can still recount the experience when woken from stasis. The Space Wolves wake Bjorn periodically, and then the silence resumes, stasis reclaiming him until someone finds a reason to disturb his sleep. Veneration and imprisonment wear the same face when the subject never consented to either. Deeper in the Blood Angel's history lies a case that reveals what happens when even stasis fails. Marist, a Blood Angel's dreadnought documented in fragmentary lore, operated underground for millennia without being placed in stasis. Not years, not decades, millennia, conscious, active, underground, alone or nearly so, with no dreamless sleep between deployments and no periodic shutdown to preserve whatever sanity remained. Just continuous existence inside a metal shell beneath the earth, while centuries accumulated above like geological strata. Nobody recorded a scream, or if they did, the record didn't survive. The machine kept walking, the pilot kept existing, the chapter kept failing to intervene. Marist's horror stems from bureaucratic indifference, the flat apathy of an organization that has normalized something unspeakable and can't be bothered to maintain its own stasis protocols for the man sealed inside. If Bjorn represents the institutional version of entombment, structured, periodic, ritualized, Marist represents the quiet collapse of even those minimal protections. These horrors extend without revision into the traitor legions. Devotion to the emperor doesn't drive the practice. Loyalty to higher ideals doesn't either. Institutional refusal to waste a useful asset operates identically whether the institution flies the Aquila or the eight-pointed star. That fact alone demolishes any claim that forced entombment is fundamentally about honoring the warrior inside the machine. Malkarion, called the War Sage, served as captain of the Night Lord's 10th Company during the age when the legions still walked alongside their primarchs. His tactical brilliance made him invaluable to a legion that prized terror and precision in equal measure, a warrior of extraordinary strategic acumen. The Night Lords weaponized fear as their primary doctrine, building entire campaign strategies around the exploitation of psychological devastation. When his body was finally broken beyond repair, he knew exactly what was about to happen to him. He knew exactly what it meant, and he fought against it with the only weapon he had left, his voice. His words are recorded in Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Soul Hunter, part of the Night Lord's trilogy. They are a scream. Don't put me in a dreadnought. Let me die. Those periods between each word carry the weight of agonized precision, a man forcing each word out separately, making absolutely certain there can be no ambiguity, no future claim that delirium clouded his intent. A battlefield commander delivering the clearest order he has ever given. Don't do this to me. Let me have my death. It's mine. They did it anyway. The Night Lords, a legion whose entire identity is built around understanding fear, who pride themselves on recognizing terror more acutely than any other force in the galaxy, heard one of their greatest captains express the most primal fear a warrior can articulate, and overrode it. They took his shattered body, threaded it with neural links, submerged it in amniotic fluid, sealed the sarcophagus shut, and locked the war sage inside a walking tomb he had explicitly, desperately, repeatedly refused. His brothers genuinely believed they were preserving something irreplaceable. Tactical genius, they told themselves, too valuable to surrender to death. That rationalization is precisely the indictment. The road to the sarcophagus is always paved with institutional logic. The organization always has a reason, and the warrior's consent is always filed below the chapter's strategic needs, weighed against them, and found wanting. Malkarion's entombed existence, depicted across the full Night Lord's trilogy, is a study in what happens when resentment ferments across millennia with no outlet except obedience. He became the war sage because his brothers needed the title to justify what they'd done. They needed the tactical counsel he dispensed from inside his coffin to retroactively validate the decision to put him there. His relationship with Talos and First Claw, the protagonist of the trilogy, is saturated with the uncomfortable dynamics of a man whose continued existence serves his captor's purposes more than his own. Malkarion gives counsel because there is nothing else to do inside the sarcophagus between deployments. He fights when woken because the alternative is stasis, a void offering no dreams, no peace, only the lurching discontinuity of waking to find that decades or centuries have passed and nothing has changed except that there are fewer brothers left to wake him. Every tactical insight he delivers, every battle he wins, reinforces the institutional logic that entombed him. His competence is his cage. The better he performs, the more his brothers congratulate themselves on the wisdom of ignoring his screams, and the further his original plea, "Let me die," recedes beneath the weight of accumulated operational success. The Imperium's mythology of Dreadnought invulnerability shatters completely in Ian Watson's Inquisition War trilogy. The Calidus assassin Melindi eliminated the Grand Master of Assassins by stuffing clothes and rags into a Dreadnought's exhaust port. The Grand Master, supreme overseer of the Imperium's deadliest operatives, deemed too valuable for an ordinary death, entombed in a walking monument to eternal service, suffocated by laundry. He didn't receive the glorious second death in combat that the Dreadnought tradition promises its occupants. He choked inside the machine that was supposed to grant him immortality. The distance between what the Imperium claims the Dreadnought is, invulnerable, eternal, sacred, and what the machine actually proved to be in that moment, a box with vents that a woman armed with cloth could exploit, undermines every piece of propaganda ever written about the walking tomb. The honor couldn't even protect its occupant from a bundle of rags. Each of these structural failures, consent overridden in Malkarion's case, stasis protocols abandoned in Marist's, and the machine's physical invulnerability exposed as a myth by Melindy's assassination, demonstrates a different facet of a system that considers individual suffering acceptable overhead for institutional continuity. None of them are aberrations. All of them are features. Yet somehow, across 10,000 years of accumulated evidence about the practice's horrors, someone examined the tradition and decided the problem wasn't the cruelty. The problem was that the cruelty wasn't efficient enough. Belisarius Cawl, the Imperium's 10,000-year-old Archmagos Dominus, carries the perpetual suspicion of tech heresy, the way a suspect carries a prior conviction, permanently, visibly, and with an institutional record that grows longer each century. Creator of the Primaris Space Marines, architect of innovations that every chapter uses, while simultaneously whispering about with the nervous distrust usually reserved for active threats, Call operates with the serene confidence of a being who has never once been required to endure the consequences of his own designs. The Redemptor Dreadnought chassis was, in careful official language, rediscovered from ancient standard template construct blueprints. Both the fan community and in-universe characters greet this claim with open sarcasm that constitutes, in the grim darkness of the far future, the nearest thing to accountability the Mechanicus will ever face. By every measurable tactical metric, the Redemptor surpasses the standard Castroferum pattern. More powerful, more versatile, better armed and armored, capable of feats the older designs can't match. And by the metric that actually matters, the survival and sanity of the pilot sealed inside, the Redemptor is a disaster that makes its predecessor look almost gentle. The chassis runs a neural interface deeper and more invasive than any older pattern. The connection between pilot and machine reaches further into the occupant's nervous system, demands more from the biological component, and degrades it faster than the Castroferum's designers either could achieve or deliberately chose to avoid. Redemptor pilots don't endure millennia of slow deterioration. They burn. Neural strain erodes their minds and bodies at a rate that compresses the old horror into something accelerated and disposable. Where an old pattern Dreadnought pilot might persist for thousands of years, waking, fighting, returning to stasis, accumulating the layers of experience and grief and battle knowledge that eventually earn the designation venerable, a Redemptor pilot is consumed, used up, discarded. The lore confirms the implication with the flatness of a coroner's report. There will be no venerable Redemptor Dreadnoughts. That sentence erases something the Imperium spent 10 millennia building. A venerable Dreadnought is one of the most treasured assets a chapter possesses, a living link to its founding era, a repository of battle lore spanning ages, a witness to events every other participant has long since died from. Bjorn the Fell-Handed carries venerable status because he endured long enough to become irreplaceable as a living archive. When the Space Wolves wake Bjorn from stasis, he speaks with the authority of 10,000 years of continuous, if interrupted, existence. Venerable status was the one thing the Imperium could point to and claim that entombment preserved something no other method could, that the suffering served a purpose, that the coffin produced meaning, however late and however small. Call's Redemptor eliminates that possibility with the clinical efficiency of a man optimizing throughput. His design prioritizes power output over pilot longevity because in his calculus, and by extension in the Imperium's, the value of a Space Marine inside a coffin is measured in damage dealt before nervous system failure. Centuries of accumulated wisdom don't factor into the equation. Millennia of living testimony don't register as a variable worth preserving. The pilot is fuel. The machine is the asset. When the fuel is spent, the sarcophagus opens, and what remains, the lore goes completely silent on that point. That silence carries its own weight. The old Dreadnoughts tortured you forever, but offered the possibility of legacy. The new ones torture you and throw you away. That shift changes what the cruelty means, transforming entombment from an institution capable of producing meaning, however twisted, however unjustified, into one that has abandoned even the pretense of caring what happens to the man inside. Call has never climbed inside a Redemptor to test the neural interface on his own nervous system. Across 10,000 years of accumulated innovations, each one bearing someone else's cost, the Archmagos has operated from behind workbenches and data slates, while other bodies absorb the consequences. He handed the Redemptor to the chapters with assurances of its superiority, returned to his laboratorium, and moved on. Every pilot who burns out validates a calculation he performed at a comfortable distance from any sarcophagus. The Blood Angels field a variant that compounds the horror beyond even the Redemptor's accelerated cruelty. Librarian Dreadnoughts entomb psychers. Space Marine librarians who retain their full psychic abilities inside the sarcophagus. A psyker already lives under the permanent burden of perceiving the warp, channeling energies that corrode sanity by their fundamental nature. Even ambulatory and surrounded by brothers, a librarian fights a constant interior battle against visions, psychic bleed-through, and the attention of entities that hunger for minds capable of perceiving them. Seal that psyker inside a coffin with no escape from the physical prison or the psychic one, and you've constructed something uniquely terrible. A double imprisonment where ceramite walls hold the body while the immaterium presses against a mind that can never stop perceiving it. No physical world to anchor him, no battle brothers to ground him, just the amniotic fluid, the neural links, and the endless screaming of the immaterium pressing against his mind with nothing between him and it except his will. Blood Angels librarian dreadnoughts are the rarest and most feared of their kind, and their omission from most discussions of dreadnought horror is itself a form of institutional erasure. One more layer of silence over something the Imperium would rather not examine too closely. All of it. Malkarian's scream, Marist's millennia underground, the Redemptor's disposable pilots, the librarian's double cage, the Grand Master suffocated by rags in a machine that was supposed to make him eternal, converges on one name. The name promised at the beginning, held until now because he has earned at least that much consideration. Commander Dante, Chapter Master of the Blood Angels, over 1,500 years of continuous service, the longest tenure of any loyalist space marine not sustained by a dreadnought sarcophagus. Te Kahurangi, Chief Librarian of the Carcharodon's Astra, trails him by only about a century, but Dante carries burdens Te Kahurangi doesn't. Dante carries prophecy. He carries exhaustion ground into the marrow of a body that has outlasted every reasonable expectation placed on it. And he carries the genetic curse that has hounded the sons of Sanguinius. Every blood angel fights the pull of the black rage, the curse that haunts the sons of Sanguinius. Alongside the black rage runs the red thirst, lurking beneath blood angels' discipline like a second pulse. Dante has suppressed the red thirst for over 1,000 years through sheer force of will, and outrun the black rage longer than any other son of Sanguinius. An achievement that would be extraordinary in a warrior a third his age, and that becomes almost incomprehensible across the span he has endured. He has resisted the madness longer than nearly any son of Sanguinius who ever lived. Over 1,000 years of pushing back against a curse engineered to break him, while simultaneously commanding a chapter, prosecuting wars across the galaxy, and watching brother after brother fall to the very madness he keeps refusing to surrender to. Guy Haley's novel Dante maps what 15 centuries of unbroken warfare have done to this man's interior landscape. Transhuman physiology handles physical fatigue. Biological enhancements compensate for the cellular degradation that would kill a baseline human many lifetimes over. None of that touches the weariness that has settled into Dante's soul, the bone-deep exhaustion of watching brothers die for 1,000 years, watching worlds burn under threats that multiply faster than any force can contain them, watching the Imperium demand more from a warrior who gave everything he had before most living space marines were born. Dante has wanted to die for centuries. He's carried that wish quietly behind the golden death mask of Sanguinius that he wears into battle, behind the obligations that pile higher with every decade that refuses to kill him. He survived the devastation of Baal, the apocalyptic Tyranid invasion that descended on the Blood Angels' homeworld. The defense of Baal nearly annihilated the chapter. Dante fought at the center of a battle that should have been his last, against a foe that should have been his end, on a world whose survival demanded everything he had left to give. He survived. The galaxy, as it has for 1,500 years, refused to grant him the death he'd earned. Rabute Gilliman, the returned Primarch, rewarded Dante's survival by appointing him regent of Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy severed from the Emperor's light by the Great Rift. More duty. More centuries of obligations stretching ahead of him like a corridor with no end. More mornings on burning worlds he never asked to see. More battles fought by a man whose primary wish, to finally stop, has been denied by every force in the galaxy that claims authority over his existence. The Sanguinor prophecy hangs over everything. Ancient Blood Angels lore holds that a golden warrior will stand between the Emperor and darkness at the end of all things. Dante carries that prophecy like a chain forged from obligation and dread, each link another reason the chapter will never allow him to rest. He fights because the prophecy demands it. He endures because his chapter needs him to endure. He persists because the Imperium decided long ago that Dante's death belongs to the Imperium, not to Dante. Does he deserve a death? A real one? A permanent one? 1,500 years of service say yes. The Imperium's institutional logic says no. And looming at the edge of every tomorrow is the sarcophagus, the walking coffin. The Imperium's highest honor, patient and inevitable, waiting for the moment his body finally fails and his chapter decides. As Malkarian's brothers decided 10,000 years before, that a warrior's plea matters less than his continued usefulness. If the Blood Angels seal Dante inside a Redemptor, Call's design burns through him so quickly and so completely, denying the most deserving warrior alive the only consolation the old tradition ever offered. If they choose a Castraferum, he drifts through centuries of sensory deprivation, woken periodically to dispense wisdom he never wanted to accumulate, fighting on worlds he can't feel beneath feet he no longer has, carrying the Sanguinor prophecy inside a coffin where prophecy and madness become indistinguishable. Either chassis, either outcome. The man who earned his death 1,000 years ago will never be allowed to keep it. In the Imperium, even death isn't yours. Subscribe for more stories like this.